There are places in this world where the walls hold secrets so dark, so unimaginable that when they finally come to light, they force us to question everything we thought we knew about human nature. In the quiet town of Amstetten, Austria, population roughly 23,000, there stood an ordinary gray apartment building at 40 Ibstrasse. From the outside, nothing about this place suggested horror. Neighbors passed it daily. Children played nearby. Life moved on in its predictable rhythms. But beneath the concrete foundation, behind reinforced doors that only one man could open, a nightmare was unfolding that would span nearly a quarter of a century. This is the story of Josef Fritzl, the man who turned his own home into a dungeon, and his daughter Elisabeth, who survived 8,516 days of captivity in absolute darkness. What happened in that cellar challenges our understanding of evil, resilience, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the most monstrous acts occur in the most ordinary places. April 19, 2008. It's a Saturday evening when a 73-year-old man arrives at Amstetten's Mauer Hospital with an unconscious 19-year-old girl. The girl is in critical condition, her body frail, her skin pale from what appears to be severe illness. The elderly man who brought her in introduces himself as Josef Fritzl, claiming to be the girl's grandfather. He explains that the young woman's name is Kirsten, and that her mother, his daughter Elisabeth, had left her on his doorstep with a note. According to Joseph, Elisabeth had run away to join a cult 24 years earlier and occasionally dropped off children for him and his wife to raise. It's a strange story, but Joseph tells it with conviction, with the confidence of a man who's been rehearsing these lies for decades. The medical staff at Mauer Hospital are immediately alarmed by Kirsten's condition. She's suffering from kidney failure, she's severely malnourished, and her teeth are in terrible shape. Dr. Albert Reiter, the attending physician, has never seen anything quite like this. The girl looks like she's been living in conditions of extreme deprivation. When Joseph can't provide any medical history for Kirsten, when he can't answer basic questions about her health, the doctors grow suspicious. Something doesn't add up. They ask Joseph to bring Kirsten's mother to the hospital. They need to speak with Elisabeth. Joseph agrees, but days pass and Elisabeth doesn't appear. The doctors become more concerned. Kirsten's condition is deteriorating. On April 23, the hospital makes a public appeal through Austrian media, begging Elisabeth Fritzl to come forward. They need her medical history. They need information that could save her daughter's life. The appeal is broadcast on television, published in newspapers. It reaches every corner of Austria. And somehow, Joseph convinces himself he can maintain control of the situation. He makes a decision that will finally unravel his carefully constructed web of lies. He decides to bring Elisabeth to the hospital. But Elisabeth doesn't come alone. When Joseph releases her from the cellar on April 26, 2008, he brings her upstairs along with two young men, Stefan, age 18, and Felix, age 5. He tells his wife Rosemary, who has been living in the house above for all these years, that Elisabeth has miraculously decided to return home after 24 years with the cult. It's a claim so absurd, so transparently false, that it's remarkable anyone believed it even for a moment. But Rosemary appears to accept this explanation. Joseph then takes Elisabeth to the hospital. At the hospital, something extraordinary happens. Someone, perhaps a nurse or doctor who senses something deeply wrong, makes an anonymous call to the police. When officers arrive and begin questioning Joseph and Elisabeth separately, the truth finally emerges. Elisabeth, speaking to investigators alone, tells them a story so horrifying that it will make headlines around the world. She hasn't been in a cult. She's been in the cellar. For 24 years, her father has held her prisoner in a dungeon beneath their family home, regularly raping her and fathering 7 children with her in that underground hell. The officers can barely comprehend what they're hearing. Josef Fritzl is arrested that same day, April 26, 2008. When police descend into the cellar at 40 Ibstrasse, they discover a nightmare made real. The underground prison is a maze of narrow corridors and cramped rooms, some barely tall enough for an adult to stand upright. The ceilings are so low that anyone over 5 feet 8 inches would have to stoop constantly. The walls are damp and moldy. There's no natural light, no fresh air. This has been Elisabeth's entire world for nearly 9,000 days. This is where she gave birth to 7 children. This is where 3 of those children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, lived their entire lives, never once seeing the sun. To understand how something this monstrous could happen, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand Josef Fritzl. Born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, Austria, Josef entered the world during a time of profound instability. Austria was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, and within a few years, the Nazi regime would annex the country, plunging it into World War II. But the chaos of history wasn't Josef's only challenge. His childhood was marked by another kind of violence, quieter but no less destructive. Josef's mother, Maria, was by all accounts a harsh and domineering woman. Josef's father was absent. His mother raised him alone, and she did so with an iron fist. In his later testimony, Josef would describe his mother as cold, abusive, and controlling. She beat him, humiliated him, and according to his own accounts, made his childhood a living hell. There's a psychological term for what Josef experienced. It's called displacement. When someone suffers abuse, they sometimes redirect that pain onto someone more vulnerable. They become the abuser. They recreate the power dynamics that once victimized them, but this time, they're in control. This doesn't excuse what Josef would later do. Nothing could excuse that. But it provides a window into how a person becomes capable of such cruelty. Josef grew up to be an electrical engineer and a businessman. He was intelligent, technically skilled, and by all outward appearances, a respectable member of the community. In 1956, at age 21, he married a woman named Rosemary. Together, they would have 7 children over the years: Ulrich Rosemary Jr., Harold Gabrielle Joseph Jr., Doris and Elisabeth, who was born on April 6, 1966. To their neighbors, to the people of Amstetten, the Fritzls seemed like an ordinary family. Josef was known as a stern but hardworking man. He held down jobs, he provided for his family, he maintained his property. No one suspected that behind the facade of respectability, Josef was nurturing dark compulsion that would eventually consume everything. But there were signs, if anyone had been looking closely enough. In 1967, when Josef was 32 years old, he was convicted of rape. The details of that case remain somewhat obscure, but it's known that he attacked a young woman, and he served time in prison for it. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a pattern beginning to emerge. After his release, Josef returned to his family, and on the surface, he resumed his normal life. But the compulsions that led to that attack never went away. They festered, they grew, and eventually they found a new target much closer to home. In the late 1970s, Josef's mother Maria moved into the Fritzl household. The woman who had tormented Josef throughout his childhood now lived in the attic of his home. And then in 1980, Maria died. But here's the disturbing part. Maria died in captivity. Josef, by multiple accounts, had essentially imprisoned his own mother in the attic before her death. It was a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. Josef had learned that he could control people through confinement. He had learned that he had the power to make someone completely dependent on him, to erase them from the outside world. And he was about to apply those lessons to his youngest daughter. Elisabeth Fritzl was a normal girl. Let's be very clear about that. She wasn't troubled. She wasn't wayward. She was just a regular kid growing up in a small Austrian town. She went to school. She had friends. She had dreams. People who knew her remember her as bright, cheerful, and full of life. But within the walls of the Fritzl home, something terrible was already happening. Starting in 1977, when Elisabeth was just 11 years old, her father began essaying her. She was a child. She was his daughter, and he violated her repeatedly, systematically, stealing her innocence and her sense of safety. Think about what that means. Think about being 11 years old and having the one person who's supposed to protect you become the source of your greatest fear. Elisabeth couldn't escape to school because she knew she'd have to come home. She couldn't tell her mother because, well, how does a child even begin to articulate that horror? And Joseph made sure she understood the consequences of telling anyone. He threatened her. He isolated her. He made her believe that she was powerless, that no one would believe her even if she tried to speak up. As Elisabeth got older, she tried to break free. In her teenage years, she attempted to run away from home multiple times. This wasn't rebellion. This was survival. She was trying to escape the ongoing SA, the suffocating control of her father. But each time she was found and brought back. Austrian authorities treated her as a runaway, not as a victim. They didn't investigate why a young girl would be so desperate to leave her family. They just returned her to the house on Imprisoned, delivering her right back into her abuser's hands. In hindsight, it's one of the most tragic failures in this entire story. If someone, anyone, had looked a little deeper, had asked the right questions, Elisabeth might have been saved. Decades of suffering might have been prevented. By the time Elisabeth reached 18, she had completed her schooling and was beginning to envision a life beyond Amstetten. She had dreams of becoming a waitress, of getting her own place, of finally being free from her father's control. It was 1984. She was on the cusp of adulthood, that moment when young people start to build their own identities, make their own choices. For most 18-year-olds, it's an exciting time. For Elisabeth, it represented hope, but Joseph had other plans. He had been planning for years, and in the summer of 1984, those plans were about to come to fruition. Here's something you need to understand about Josef Fritzl. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. This was premeditated. This was calculated. This was engineered with the same precision Joseph applied to his electrical work. Starting around 1978, even before his mother died, Joseph had begun planning the construction of a hidden cellar beneath his home. He was already thinking about imprisonment. He was already imagining how he could create a space where he would have absolute control, where he could keep someone cut off from the world entirely. Between 1981 and 1982, Joseph began the actual construction. The Fritzl house had a basement, as many European homes do, but Joseph wanted something more. He wanted something hidden, something that no one would ever find unless he wanted them to. Using his skills as an engineer and an electrician, he designed a complex underground maze. He created corridors so narrow you had to crawl through them. He built cupboards with false doors that led to hidden passageways. He installed reinforced doors with electronic locks that could only be opened with a remote control code, a code that only he possessed. The cellar was initially about 35 square meters, roughly 377 square feet. That's smaller than many studio apartments, and it would eventually house a family. By summer 1983, the cellar was complete. Joseph told his family and neighbors that he was building workshops and storage areas. No one questioned it. Why would they? Joseph was known for his building projects, his technical expertise, and in Austria there's a strong cultural emphasis on privacy. You don't pry into your neighbor's business. You don't ask too many questions. This cultural norm, this respect for privacy, would become one of the factors that allowed Joseph's crimes to continue for so long. People simply didn't question what Josef Fritzl was doing in his own basement. The cellar itself was a masterpiece of horrific ingenuity. Joseph installed electricity, though the lighting was always dim. He put in a wash basin, a toilet, a bed, a hot plate for cooking, and a small refrigerator. These weren't comforts. They were the bare minimum to keep someone alive. The ceilings were oppressively low, about 170 centimeters in some places, just over 5.5 feet. Anyone taller than that would spend their entire life stooped over. The walls were concrete, thick and soundproof. You could scream in that cellar and no one upstairs would hear a thing. There were no windows, no fresh air, no natural light. Time itself would become meaningless down there. In August 1984, everything was ready. Joseph had built his prison. Now he needed his prisoner. August 28, 1984. Elisabeth Fritzl is 18 years old. She's living at home still, but she's making plans to move out to start her life. On this particular evening, her father asks her to help him carry a door down to the cellar. It's a simple request. There's no reason for Elisabeth to suspect anything. She's helped her father with household tasks countless times, so she follows him. When they reach the cellar, Josef tells Elisabeth to hold the door in place while he fits it. She steps inside the hidden room, and then in one swift motion, Josef presses a rag soaked with ether over Elisabeth's face. The chemical overwhelms her. She loses consciousness. When she wakes up, she's chained to a bed in the cellar. The door is locked, and her father is standing over her, explaining her new reality. Josef tells Elisabeth that she's never leaving. He tells her that if she tries to escape, he has installed a sophisticated security system. If she attempts to breach the door, toxic gas will flood the cellar and unalive her. It's a lie, at least partially. There is no gas system, but Elisabeth has no way of knowing that. She has no way of testing whether her father is telling the truth. And the threat is enough to keep her terrified, to keep her compliant. Josef has thought of everything. Upstairs, Rosemary is frantic. Her daughter has vanished. She reports Elisabeth missing to the police. A search is launched. But a month later, in September 1984, the Fritzls receive a letter. It's supposedly from Elisabeth. The letter explains that she's run away from home, that she's tired of her family, that they shouldn't look for her. Josef, of course, has forced Elisabeth to write this letter. He's dictated every word. The handwriting is Elisabeth's, so the authorities accept it as genuine. They close the case. Elisabeth Fritzl is officially a runaway, and down in the cellar, the real nightmare is just beginning. Imagine spending 24 hours in a small, windowless room. No sunlight, no fresh air, no human contact except for the person who imprisoned you. Now imagine spending 24 days like that. Now imagine 24 months. Now imagine 24 years. That was Elisabeth's reality. For the first few months, the cellar was just a single room with a bed, a toilet, and a sink. It was approximately 35 square meters total. Elisabeth had no books, no television, no radio. She had nothing to mark the passage of time, except the meals Josef brought her and the visits he made to grape her. Josef developed a routine. He would descend into the cellar regularly, sometimes multiple times a week, to essay his daughter. In his twisted mind, this was his right. He believed he had created a perfect situation where he had total control, where Elisabeth existed solely for his gratification. Upstairs, he played the role of the grieving father whose daughter had abandoned the family. He went to work. He socialized with neighbors. He attended family gatherings. And then he would go down to the cellar and commit monstrous acts. The compartmentalization required for this double life is almost impossible to fathom. For Elisabeth, every day was a struggle for survival. The air in the cellar was stale and musty. The lack of sunlight meant she was constantly deficient in vitamin D. Her skin grew pale. Her health deteriorated. She had no exercise, no space to move freely. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical. She was completely isolated from the world. She had no idea if anyone was looking for her. She had no way of knowing if anyone even remembered her. Her entire universe had shrunk to those underground walls, and the man who controlled her every moment. In November 1986, Elisabeth became pregnant for the first time. She was 20 years old, and the child was, of course, her father's. She had no prenatal care, no medical supervision. She was trapped in a cellar with no one to help her. At 10 weeks, she miscarried. The loss of that pregnancy in those conditions must have been physically agonizing and emotionally devastating. But there was no one to comfort her, no one to help her process the trauma. There was only Josef, who saw her not as a human being enduring unimaginable suffering, but as a possession that had temporarily malfunctioned. 2 years later, in 1988, Elisabeth became pregnant again. This time, she carried the baby to term. On August 30, 1988, in that dark, damp cellar, Elisabeth gave birth to a baby girl. She was completely alone during the labor. Josef didn't help. He didn't call a doctor. Elisabeth delivered her own daughter with no medical assistance, no pain relief, nothing. It's hard to express how dangerous this was. Childbirth, even under ideal circumstances, can be life-threatening. Women die from complications. Bobbies die from complications. But somehow, miraculously, both Elisabeth and her newborn daughter survived. Elisabeth named her Kirsten. Kirsten's arrival changed everything. Suddenly, Elisabeth wasn't just surviving for herself. She had a daughter to protect, a daughter who would grow up in this cellar unless something changed. But nothing did change. Josef had no intention of releasing them. Instead, he simply adjusted to the new reality. Now there were two prisoners instead of one. As Kirsten grew from an infant to a toddler, she knew nothing else but the cellar. She never saw the sky. She never felt grass beneath her feet. She never met another child. Her entire world consisted of her mother and her grandfather, who would descend into the cellar to bring food and to continue graping Elisabeth. To Kirsten, this was normal. She had no frame of reference for anything different. On February 1, 1990, Elisabeth gave birth to her second child in the cellar, a boy she named Stefan. Again, she delivered the baby alone, with no medical assistance. Now there were three people in that tiny underground space, two children who had never seen daylight, and a mother trying desperately to give them some semblance of normalcy in an utterly abnormal situation. Elisabeth taught them to speak. She tried to educate them as best she could with no materials, no books. She created routines to give structure to their days, even though day and night were meaningless in the perpetual artificial light of the cellar. On August 29, 1992, Elisabeth gave birth to her third child, another daughter named Lisa. But this time, Josef decided something different. When Lisa was 9 months old in May 1993, Josef took the baby upstairs. He brought her outside and left her in a cardboard box on the family's doorstep, along with a note supposedly written by Elisabeth. The note asked that the child be looked after, claiming that Elisabeth couldn't care for her. Rosemary discovered the baby and immediately contacted the authorities. After some bureaucratic process, Rosemary and Josef were allowed to adopt Lisa and raise her as their own. Think about what this means. Lisa was Elisabeth's daughter, but she was raised believing Rosemary was her mother and Josef was her father. She grew up in the same house where her real mother and siblings were imprisoned below. The duplicity, the layers of deception, are staggering. And it raises questions. Did Rosemary really believe that her daughter, who had supposedly joined a cult and disappeared, would keep leaving bobbies on their doorstep? Did she never question the story? Or did she choose not to question it because the truth was too terrible to confront? In 1993, something else significant happened. Elisabeth begged Josef to expand the cellar. With three children still living underground, Kirsten, Stefan, and herself, the 35-square-meter space was becoming unbearably cramped. Josef agreed, but he didn't hire construction workers. Instead, he forced Elisabeth and the children to do the work themselves. For years, Elisabeth and her children dug out soil with their bare hands, excavating space to expand their prison from 35 square meters to 55 square meters. They were literally digging their own dungeon, making it bigger, more livable, because there was no hope of escape. The expansion gave them slightly more space, but it came at the cost of years of hard labor in addition to everything else they were enduring. On February 26, 1994, Elisabeth gave birth to her fourth child, a daughter named Monica. Like Lisa before her, Monica was taken upstairs when she was 10 months old. In December 1994, Josef left the baby in a pushchair outside the house. Rosemary found her, along with another note from Elisabeth. Shortly after Monica appeared, Rosemary received a phone call from someone who sounded like Elisabeth, asking her to take care of the child. In reality, Josef had recorded Elisabeth's voice and played it over the phone. Rosemary reported this incident to the police, expressing confusion about how Elisabeth knew their unlisted phone number. But again, the authorities didn't investigate further. Monica was adopted by the Fritzls and raised upstairs. On April 28, 1996, Elisabeth gave birth to twin boys, Michael and Alexander. This birth was particularly tragic. Michael was weak from the start, possibly because of the inbreeding, possibly because of the terrible conditions of the cellar. He lived for only 3 days. When the infant died, Joseph didn't take him to a hospital or report the death. Instead, he took the tiny body upstairs and burned it in the home's heating furnace. He cremated his own son, his own grandson, and disposed of the remains as if the child had never existed. Michael Fritzl never had a birth certificate. He never had a death certificate. He was born and died in secret, his short life known only to Elisabeth and Joseph. Alexander, the surviving twin, was taken upstairs at 15 months old and discovered in similar circumstances to his sisters. He, too, was adopted by Rosemary and Joseph. So now, upstairs, there were 4 children being raised by the Fritzls: Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, plus Elisabeth's older siblings' children. And downstairs there were still 3 people trapped: Elisabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan. On December 16, 2002, Elisabeth gave birth to her 7th and final child, a boy named Felix. By this point, Joseph claimed that his wife Rosemary couldn't handle adopting another child, so Felix remained in the cellar with Elisabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan. Now there were 4 people living in that underground prison. Kirsten was 14 years old. Stefan was 12. Felix was an infant. And Elisabeth was 36, having spent 18 years of her life in captivity. By the 2000s, a bizarre double reality had solidified at 40 Imprisoned. Upstairs, 3 of Elisabeth's children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were growing up in relative normalcy. They went to school. They played with other children. They had sunlight, fresh air, and a normal Austrian childhood, albeit one shaped by the belief that their grandparents had rescued them from an unstable mother who'd abandoned them to a cult. They had no idea their real mother was directly beneath them, living in unimaginable conditions. Downstairs, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix knew nothing but the cellar. Kirsten had spent her entire life, 19 years by 2008, underground. She had never seen a tree, never felt rain, never seen the stars. Stefan had lived 18 years in the cellar. His entire existence had been in those cramped, damp rooms. Felix, the youngest in the cellar, was 5 years old by 2008 and had similarly never experienced the outside world. Elisabeth did everything she could to educate them, to give them a sense of normalcy. She taught them to read and write using materials Joseph occasionally brought down. She created games. She told them stories. She was mother, teacher, and protector, all while enduring continuous SA from Joseph. The children in the cellar developed health problems that would have been easily preventable with proper medical care and nutrition. Their teeth were rotting from poor diet and no dental care. They were extremely pale and malnourished. Their growth was stunted. They had weak bones from lack of sunlight and vitamin D. They had never built up immune systems because they'd never been exposed to normal germs and bacteria. The air they breathed was stale and full of mold spores. They were living in conditions that were slowly destroying their bodies. Joseph continued his double life with remarkable discipline. He was retired by this point, but he maintained his social connections. Neighbors described him as stern but unremarkable. Some found him a bit unfriendly, but no one suspected what was happening beneath his house. He had created such an elaborate system of lies, such a consistent narrative about Elisabeth and the cult, that even when strange things happened, like Bobby's appearing on the doorstep, people accepted his explanations. Rosemary, Joseph's wife, remains one of the most controversial figures in this story. She maintained, and has continued to maintain, that she had no idea what was happening in the cellar. She claimed that Joseph never allowed her down there, that he kept it locked, and that she simply trusted her husband's explanation about it being his workshop. But many people find this hard to believe. How could a woman not notice that her husband was spending significant amounts of time in the cellar? How could she not wonder about the supplies he was bringing down there, food for multiple people, clothing, toiletries? How could she not hear something, anything, over the course of 24 years? Some have suggested that Rosemary was another victim of Joseph's control, too frightened to question him, too conditioned to obey. Others believe she must have known something, or at least suspected, but chose to remain willfully ignorant because confronting the truth would have destroyed her entire life. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What's certain is that Rosemary adopted and raised 3 of Elisabeth's children without apparently questioning the bizarre circumstances of their appearances. She accepted a narrative that, when you really think about it, makes no sense. By early 2008, Kirsten, who was now 19 years old, began experiencing serious health problems. She was having seizures. She was losing consciousness. Elisabeth was terrified. She had watched one child die in this cellar. She couldn't bear to lose another. She begged Josef to get medical help for Kirsten. For days, Josef resisted. Taking Kirsten to the hospital would risk exposure. It would invite questions. But as Kirsten's condition worsened, Elisabeth's pleas became more desperate, and Josef finally realized he had no choice. If Kirsten died, she would be another body he'd have to dispose of, and this wasn't an infant. This was a grown woman. So on April 19, 2008, Josef brought Kirsten upstairs for the first time in her life and drove her to the hospital. The doctors at Mauer Hospital were immediately alarmed. Kirsten was in critical condition, suffering from kidney failure and severe malnutrition. But beyond her medical state, there was something deeply wrong about the situation. This 19-year-old girl had no medical records, no identification, no history. Joseph's story about the cult made little sense. Why would a mother in a cult leave her daughter on a doorstep without any way to contact her? Why was Kirsten in such terrible physical condition? When Josef couldn't answer basic medical questions about Kirsten, when he couldn't provide the information doctors needed to treat her, they became more suspicious. They insisted on speaking with Elisabeth. Josef stalled for days, but the hospital staff wasn't backing down. They made a public appeal through the media, broadcasting a plea for Josef Fritzl to come forward to help save her daughter's life. The appeal ran on Austrian television and in newspapers. The pressure was mounting. Josef had controlled this situation for 24 years, but now, for the first time, he was losing control. On April 26, 2008, Josef made the decision to release Elisabeth from the cellar, but he didn't release her to the hospital immediately. First, he brought her upstairs along with Stefan and Felix. He told Rosemary that Elisabeth had miraculously returned after 24 years, that the cult had apparently let her go. It's a testament to how deeply dysfunctional the family dynamics were that Rosemary seemed to accept this. Then Josef took Elisabeth to the hospital to see Kirsten. But someone at the hospital, we don't know who, sensed that something was terribly wrong. An anonymous call was made to the police. When officers arrived and began questioning Elisabeth separately from Josef, away from his control for the first time in 24 years, the truth finally came pouring out. Elisabeth told them everything: the imprisonment, the continuous essay, the 7 children, the cellar, the decades of captivity. The story was so horrific that the officers initially struggled to believe it. But Elisabeth's details were too specific, too consistent. And when police went to 40 Ibstrasse and descended into the cellar, they found exactly what Elisabeth had described. Josef Fritzl was arrested on April 26, 2008. The news broke almost immediately, and it sent shockwaves around the world. Austria, a country still sensitive about its image after the Natascha Kampusch kidnapping case just 2 years earlier, was plunged into a national crisis of conscience. How could something like this happen? How could a man imprison his daughter for 24 years, father 7 children with her, and no one notice? What did this say about Austrian society, about privacy norms, about the willingness of people to look the other way? The days following Josef's arrest were chaotic. Police worked to piece together the full extent of what had happened. They conducted extensive interviews with Elisabeth, who had to relive her trauma in excruciating detail to help authorities understand the scope of the crimes. They collected physical evidence from the cellar. They performed DNA tests confirming that Josef was the biological father of all 7 children. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Stefan and Felix, who had lived their entire lives in the cellar, were brought out into a world they had never known. Imagine being 18 years old and seeing the sun for the first time, seeing the sky, feeling wind. Stefan and Felix had to be hospitalized, not just for their physical ailments, but because the adjustment was so severe. Their immune systems had never been challenged by normal environmental bacteria. Their eyes had never adjusted to natural sunlight. They were, in many ways, like astronauts returning from space, needing time to reacclimate to Earth's conditions. The children who had been raised upstairs, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, suddenly learned a devastating truth. The grandparents they'd known their entire lives were actually their father and grandmother. Their real mother, whom they'd been told had abandoned them to a cult, had actually been imprisoned beneath them all along. And their siblings, whom they'd never met, had been living in a dungeon below their feet. The psychological impact of these revelations is difficult to overstate. The media descended on Amstetten like a swarm. Reporters from around the world flooded the small town, setting up cameras outside the house on Imprisoned, interviewing neighbors, trying to understand how this could have happened. The coverage was intense and at times invasive. Austrian Chancellor Alfred Gusenbauer felt compelled to address the case publicly, acknowledging the abominable events and expressing concern about Austria's international image. The case became a symbol of something deeply wrong, an indictment not just of one man, but of systems and cultures that had allowed such evil to flourish in secret. Neighbors expressed shock. They said they'd never suspected anything. Josef had seemed like a normal man, maybe a bit unfriendly, but nothing that would suggest he was capable of such monstrous acts. Some neighbors recalled hearing sounds from the cellar, but they'd never thought much of it. Josef had told them he was working on projects down there. Privacy norms in Austria meant people didn't pry. But now, in hindsight, every small detail took on sinister significance. The supplies Josef had purchased over the years, the fact that his basement door was always locked, the way he guarded his privacy so jealously, all of it, in retrospect, should have raised red flags. Questions were also raised about official failures. Elisabeth had been reported missing in 1984. She had attempted to run away multiple times before that as a teenager. Social services and police had interacted with the family on multiple occasions when the children appeared on the doorstep. Why had no one investigated more thoroughly? Why had authorities accepted Josef's cult story at face value? How many opportunities to save Elisabeth and her children had been missed over 24 years? These questions would linger long after the trial ended. Josef Fritzl's trial began on March 16, 2009, in the city of St. Pölten, about 33 kilometers from Amstetten. The courtroom was presided over by Judge Andrea Humer, and the proceedings would last only 4 days, but those 4 days would reveal the full extent of Josef's crimes in graphic, disturbing detail. Josef was charged with multiple crimes: enslavement, incest, numerous counts of rape, coercion, false imprisonment, and most seriously, negligent unaliving for the death of the infant Michael. If convicted on all charges, Josef faced life. When Josef entered the courtroom on the first day, he attempted to hide his face from cameras behind a blue folder. Under Austrian law, he was entitled to this privacy. But the image of him trying to shield himself became iconic, representing a man who had operated in secrecy and darkness now being forced into the light. After opening statements, journalists and spectators were asked to leave the courtroom to protect the privacy of the victims. Only then did Josef lower his folder. Initially, Josef pleaded guilty to all charges except the most serious ones. He admitted to the enslavement, the rape, the incest, but he denied unaliving Michael through negligence. He also denied that his imprisonment of Elisabeth constituted enslavement, arguing that he had provided for her needs. His defense attorney, Rudolf Mayer, attempted to humanize Josef, famously stating that he was not a monster, and noting that Josef had brought a Christmas tree down to the cellar during the holiday season. The argument was tone-deaf and insulting. A Christmas tree doesn't negate 24 years of imprisonment and continuous SA. The comment sparked outrage. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Christiane Burkheiser, pressed for life imprisonment in a psychiatric institution. She argued that Josef was a danger to society and would always be a danger. To illustrate the conditions of Elisabeth's imprisonment, Burkheiser made a mark on the courtroom door at 174 centimeters, roughly 5 feet 8.5 inches, to show the height of the cellar ceiling. She passed around a box of musty objects taken from the cellar, and the odor was so strong that jurors physically recoiled. She was making the horror tangible, forcing everyone in that courtroom to viscerally understand what Elisabeth had endured. The centerpiece of the trial was Elisabeth's testimony, but Elisabeth didn't testify in person. The trauma was too great, the prospect of facing her father too overwhelming. Instead, over the course of the first day, jurors watched 11 hours of video testimony that Elisabeth had recorded in sessions with police and psychologists in July 2008. The footage was described as harrowing. Jurors watched it in segments, no more than 2 hours at a time, because it was too emotionally overwhelming to watch continuously. 4 replacement jurors were kept on standby in case any of the regular jurors couldn't bear to hear any more. That's how disturbing Elisabeth's testimony was. Elisabeth described, in her own words, the day her father imprisoned her. She described the SA, the births, the death of Michael, the conditions of the cellar. She described living for 24 years in fear, in darkness, teaching her children and trying to give them hope even when she had none herself. She described the moment Kirsten became ill and her desperate pleas to Josef to get help. The testimony was comprehensive and devastating. When it ended, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about what Josef had done. Other witnesses testified as well. Elisabeth's older brother Harold took the stand to describe the physical abuse Josef had inflicted on him as a child, establishing a pattern of violence and control. Psychiatrists testified about Josef's psychological state. Dr. Adelheid Kastner, a forensic psychiatrist, delivered particularly damning testimony. She stated that Josef was born to grape, that his deviant urges were so deeply ingrained that he would always pose a threat. She recommended that he be confined to a psychiatric facility. On March 18, the second day of the trial, something extraordinary happened. Elisabeth, who had indicated she never wanted to see her father again, attended the proceedings in disguise. She sat in the visitors' gallery, concealed so Josef wouldn't recognize her. But at some point during her video testimony, Josef looked up and saw her. Their eyes met. In that moment, according to Josef's attorney, you could see Josef Fritzl going pale and he broke down. It was a meeting of eyes that apparently changed something in Josef. Perhaps for the first time, he was confronted with Elisabeth as a real person rather than a possession. Perhaps he saw the strength she'd gained, the fact that she had survived and he no longer controlled her. The next day, March 19, Josef approached the judge and changed his pleas. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including the negligent unaliving of Michael and the enslavement of Elisabeth. The trial, which had been expected to last longer, was suddenly nearing its end. Judge Andrea Humer delivered the verdict and sentence the same day. Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Additionally, he was to be incarcerated in a psychiatric institution for the criminally insane rather than a regular prison, reflecting the court's determination that he was a continuing danger to society. Josef accepted the sentence without appeal. He had no grounds to appeal anyway. The evidence was incontrovertible. As Josef was led out of the courtroom, his life as he'd known it was over. But for Elisabeth and her children, a different kind of challenge was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children, Kirsten, Stefan, Felix, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were placed in a specialized clinic for intensive therapy and medical treatment. They weren't just dealing with physical ailments, though those were serious enough. They were dealing with profound psychological trauma that would require years, possibly decades, to process. Kirsten, who had fallen ill and whose hospitalization had triggered the unraveling of Joseph's crimes, fortunately recovered from the kidney failure that had nearly unalived her. But she faced a long road ahead. At 19 years old, she had to learn about a world she'd never experienced. She had to process the fact that her entire life had been a lie, or rather, a nightmare that was finally ending. She had to build an identity beyond cellar victim. Stefan, at 18, faced similar challenges. He'd never been to school, he'd never had friends, he'd never experienced normal socialization. Therapists described the adjustment as extraordinarily difficult. Things that most people take for granted, traffic, crowds, weather, were overwhelming and frightening to Stefan and his siblings. They had to learn not just academic knowledge but basic life skills. Felix, the youngest who'd been in the cellar, was 5 years old. In some ways, his youth made the adjustment slightly easier. He was young enough that his brain was still developing, still adaptable, but he'd still spent his entire conscious life underground. He had to learn what trees were, what animals were, what the sky was. He had to learn that the world was vast and complex, not just a few small rooms. Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, who'd been raised upstairs, had their own trauma to process. They had to come to terms with the fact that the people they'd called grandparents were actually one of their parents and their grandmother. They had to integrate with siblings they'd never known. They had to reconcile years of lies. In some ways, their psychological journey was as complicated as their siblings, because they had to unlearn and recontextualize their entire childhood. And Elisabeth, at 42, had to learn how to exist outside of captivity. She'd been imprisoned from age 18 to 42, essentially her entire adult life. She'd missed the evolution of technology, culture, society. The world of 2008 was radically different from the world of 1984. Elisabeth had never used a cell phone. She'd barely experienced the internet. She'd missed decades of history. But more than that, she had to learn how to trust again, how to feel safe, how to exist without the constant fear that had defined her life for 24 years. The Austrian government provided extensive support. Elisabeth and her children were given new identities to protect them from media intrusion. They were relocated to a small, undisclosed village that the media dubbed Village X. Their new home was equipped with 24/7 surveillance, bodyguards, and security measures to ensure their safety and privacy. They had ongoing access to therapists, doctors, and specialists. The government essentially built an entirely new life for them. Over time, encouraging signs of progress emerged. Reports indicated that the family was bonding, that the children were developing relationships with each other. Elisabeth, despite everything she'd endured, proved to be a remarkably strong and loving mother. She held the family together. She helped her children heal even as she was healing herself. In many ways, she'd been doing this all along in the cellar, protecting and nurturing her children under impossible circumstances. Now she could do it in the light. Rosemary initially sought a divorce from Joseph. In 2009, she filed papers to end their marriage, which was understandable given what had been revealed. But in a strange twist, by 2010, reports emerged that Rosemary was telling people that Joseph still loved her and she might still love him. In 2012, their divorce was finalized, but the back-and-forth reveals the complicated, dysfunctional psychology at play. Rosemary had spent her entire adult life with Joseph. Accepting what he'd done, accepting her potential role in enabling it through willful ignorance, was perhaps too difficult. The human mind sometimes chooses familiar dysfunction over confronting unbearable truths. As for the house at 40 Ibstrasse, it became a grim tourist attraction. People came from around the world to take photos, to stand outside the place where such horror had occurred. The remaining tenants moved out shortly after the truth emerged. No one wanted to live in the House of Horrors. The building stood empty, a concrete monument to evil. In January 2011, Amstetten's mayor, Herbert Katzengruber, announced that the building would be demolished. He said he would prefer it to happen under cover of darkness, to avoid turning the demolition into a media spectacle. The last thing Amstetten needed was more attention, more cameras, more reminders that this had happened in their town. But demolition plans stalled. The building remained. In 2013, a decision was made to fill the cellar with concrete before selling the property. Small holes were drilled, and tubes were fed through to pump concrete into the underground rooms where Elisabeth and her children had been imprisoned. The idea was to ensure that no one could ever enter the cellar again, that it would be sealed permanently, buried beneath tons of concrete like a tomb. The work took about 2 weeks. The cellar that Josef Fritzl had spent years constructing, that had held his daughter captive for 24 years, was finally and irrevocably destroyed. Josef, meanwhile, began serving his life sentence at Garsten Abbey, a former monastery in Upper Austria that had been converted into a prison. It's a secure psychiatric facility designed for Austria's most dangerous criminals. Josef was placed in preventive detention, meaning he was separated from the general prison population for his own safety. Even among criminals, those who harm children are considered the lowest of the low. Over the years, Josef's health has deteriorated. Reports from the 2020s describe him as suffering from dementia. By 2024, at age 88, Josef was a frail, elderly man, a far cry from the controlling tyrant who had built a dungeon. In January 2024, Josef's legal team made an application to transfer him from the psychiatric facility to a regular prison, arguing that he was no longer a danger given his advanced age and poor health. The request was initially approved by a court in Krems, but prosecutors appealed, and a higher court overturned the decision in March 2024. The legal wrangling continued. In May 2024, another hearing was held, and this time the transfer to regular prison was approved. Prosecutors could still challenge the decision, but the tide seemed to be shifting. Josef's lawyer argued that her client was too old and sick to pose any threat. She complained that prosecutors were unnecessarily delaying the procedure. But many people felt that Josef's comfort and medical condition were irrelevant. He had inflicted 24 years of suffering. Why should his final years be made easier? There were concerns that transfer to a regular prison was the first step toward Josef eventually seeking full release. From a regular prison, inmates can apply for parole. Given Josef's age and health, there was speculation that he might argue for compassionate release. But in October 2025, those concerns were put to rest. A court denied Josef Fritzl's request for release. Despite his failing health, despite his age, he would remain imprisoned. The court determined that even a diminished Josef Fritzl represented enough of a threat, or perhaps that the severity of his crimes was so great that mercy was inappropriate. He will, in all likelihood, die in prison. The Fritzl case forced Austria to confront uncomfortable questions about its culture and systems. This wasn't the first high-profile case of long-term captivity in Austria, just 2 years before Elisabeth's escape. In 2006, a young woman named Natasha Kampusch had escaped after being held captive for 8 years. 2 such cases in such a short period suggested something systemic, some aspect of Austrian society or culture that enabled these crimes. Critics pointed to Austria's strong privacy norms. There's a cultural respect for keeping out of other people's business, for not prying, for maintaining boundaries. These aren't bad values in themselves. They protect individual liberty and autonomy. But they can also create an environment where abuse goes unnoticed and unreported. When everyone minds their own business, when no one asks uncomfortable questions, perpetrators can operate with impunity. There were also questions about the police and social services. Elisabeth had been reported as a runaway. She tried to escape her home multiple times as a teenager. Bobbies had appeared on the Fritzl doorstep with implausible stories about cults. Each of these instances represented an opportunity for intervention, a chance to dig deeper and uncover what was happening. But those opportunities were missed. The system failed Elisabeth repeatedly over more than 2 decades. In response to the case, there were calls for reforms in how missing persons cases are handled, how authorities investigate unusual family situations, how social services follow up when children appear under strange circumstances. It's impossible to know if such reforms have been implemented or if they've been effective. Systemic change is slow and difficult. But the Fritzl case remains a stark reminder of what can happen when systems fail, and when a culture of privacy becomes a culture of willful blindness. What Josef Fritzl did defies easy explanation. We want to understand how a human being becomes capable of such monstrous acts. We look for explanations in his childhood abuse, in his mother's cruelty, in psychological disorders. And those factors probably played a role. Trauma can create more trauma. Abuse can cycle through generations. Joseph's psychiatrist said he was born to grape, suggesting some inherent deviance in his nature. But ultimately, explanations aren't excuses. Plenty of people suffer abuse and don't become abusers. Plenty of people have difficult childhoods and don't imprison their daughters for 24 years. At some point, we have to acknowledge that Josef Fritzl made choices. He chose to build the cellar. He chose to drug and imprison Elisabeth. He chose to grape her repeatedly. He chose to father children with her. He chose to let an infant die. Thousands of choices over thousands of days, each one reinforcing the horror. Josef Fritzl is responsible for what he did, regardless of his psychological makeup or his past trauma. But if this case is about anything, it's about more than just the evil of one man. It's about the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Elisabeth Fritzl spent 24 years in a cellar. She was subjected to continuous SA. She gave birth to 7 children in captivity, one of whom died. She raised those children in darkness with no resources, no support, no hope of rescue. And yet when she finally escaped, she didn't break. She didn't give up. She fought to rebuild her life and her children's lives. Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, who lived their entire childhoods and teenage years underground, have shown extraordinary strength in adapting to the world. The fact that they can function at all, that they can learn and grow and form relationships, is testament to human adaptability and resilience. They were raised in conditions that should have destroyed them, and yet they survived. They're surviving still. This doesn't make what happened okay. It doesn't redeem the horror, but it offers a counterpoint. For every Josef Fritzl, for every person capable of inflicting such suffering, there are survivors who prove that evil doesn't get the final word. Elisabeth is not defined by what her father did to her. She's defined by how she protected her children, how she maintained her humanity in inhumane circumstances, how she rebuilt her life after it was stolen from her. Elisabeth Fritzl and her 6 children continue to live in Village X, the location of which remains secret. Reports from those who have worked with the family describe progress that, while difficult and ongoing, is real. The children have received education. Some have jobs. They have friendships, though their social circles are necessarily limited by their need for privacy and security. They celebrate birthdays and holidays. They do normal family things, things that were impossible in the cellar. Elisabeth reportedly remarried. Her new husband, identified only as Thomas Wagner to protect his identity, is said to be a supportive partner who helps her continue to heal. The fact that Elisabeth could trust someone enough to marry them, could open herself to that kind of relationship after what her father did, is remarkable. It speaks to a capacity for recovery that's almost miraculous. The family remains intensely private, understandably so. They've given no interviews. They've written no memoirs despite surely receiving lucrative offers. They simply want to live their lives away from public scrutiny, away from being defined as the Fritzl victims. They want to be people, not symbols, and they've earned that right. Josef Fritzl remains in prison. He's changed his name to avoid notoriety, though the new name has never been publicly disclosed. He's reportedly suffering from advanced dementia, and his physical health is poor. In his more lucid moments, he has expressed what his lawyers call remorse, though whether that remorse is genuine or just a legal strategy is impossible to say. Given that he initially denied enslaving Elisabeth and unaliving Michael, before changing his pleas only when confronted with Elisabeth in court, there's reason to be skeptical. The house at 40 Imprisoned has been sold. The cellar is entombed in concrete. A new owner has taken possession of the property, though what they intend to do with it remains unclear. Perhaps they'll renovate it completely, erasing any trace of what it once was. Perhaps they'll tear it down and build something new. Or perhaps the building will simply stand, ordinary and unremarkable, hiding its dark history beneath layers of concrete and new paint. Amstetten, the town where this all happened, has tried to move on. It's a community that was scarred by what occurred within its boundaries, a place that will forever be associated with one of the worst crimes in modern Austrian history. But it's also a town full of ordinary people who had nothing to do with Josef Fritzl's crimes, people who were as horrified as anyone when the truth came out. They deserve to be more than just the backdrop to a nightmare. What happened in the cellar at 40 Imprisoned can't be neatly resolved. There's no satisfying ending, no moment of redemption that makes it all worthwhile. Elisabeth Fritzl lost 24 years of her life. Her children grew up in darkness. One child died. These facts can't be changed or undone. Josef Fritzl sitting in a prison cell doesn't balance the scales. His suffering in old age and illness doesn't equal the suffering he inflicted. But there's this. Evil does not have the final word. Josef Fritzl built a dungeon, but Elisabeth outlasted him. He tried to break her, to reduce her to nothing more than a possession, and he failed. She raised her children with love even when she had every reason to despair. She taught them, protected them, gave them hope. And when the opportunity came, she told the truth that set them all free. In the end, this is a story about many things. It's about the capacity for human evil, yes. It's about systemic failures and missed opportunities. It's about privacy and secrecy and the dark things that can flourish when no one is watching. But it's also about survival. It's about a mother's love. It's about children who lived in hell and came out the other side still capable of hope. It's about the fact that even after 24 years in a cellar, the human spirit can adapt, can heal, can find light again. If you've been affected by anything in this story, if you're experiencing abuse or know someone who is, please reach out. There are resources available, people who can help. Darkness only survives when we allow it to remain hidden. Speaking up, shining light into those dark places, that's how we prevent more cellars from being built. That's how we honor survivors like Elisabeth and her children. The Amstetten horror should never have happened, but it did. And the only way to make meaning from such senseless cruelty is to ensure it never happens again, to be vigilant, to ask questions, to look out for each other, to remember that behind every closed door could be someone desperately needing help, and to never, ever stop believing in the possibility of survival and recovery, no matter how dark things seem. Elisabeth Fritzl survived. Against all odds, against every imaginable obstacle, she survived. And she's building a life. That doesn't make what happened okay. But it does remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there is still light. There is still hope. There is still the possibility of something better on the other side of suffering.